Can you tell me, do you know how to tell when you're talking to an extroverted GPS engineer?
Sorry?
How can you tell when you're talking to an extroverted GPS engineer?
I don't know. How do you tell if you're talking to an extrovert or a GNSS engineer?
Well, if you're talking to an extroverted GNSS engineer, you can tell because when they're speaking to you, they look at the tips of your shoes. Okay, that was just to get your attention, not necessarily to reward your attention. Thank you very much for coming and welcome this evening. On behalf of our chairman at the RNT Foundation, the Honorable Greg Winfrey, who was unable to be here, he asked me to welcome you all and give you his thanks as well and best regards. And it's very nice, as always, to get the gang back together and to see everyone in such a great and informal setting after and before such important and sometimes difficult work is done. So thank you for that. So before we get going, I'd like to first make a couple of recognitions. First, our newest board member at the Resilient Navigation Timing Foundation, General Shelton. Thank you very much, sir. Welcome. Welcome aboard. Also, thanks to the sponsors for this evening's soiree. By the way, as we recognize these folks, I'm going to ask them to hold up their hands if they're here. And please, during the course of the evening, thank each one of them for their contribution towards making this event possible. First off is the National Association of Broadcasters. There. Helen Systems, right over there. Thank you very much. Spirent and Spirent Federal. Anyone from Spirent? Well, you know, that's how you know that they like you, because they send their money and they don't come, even when they can't come. So thank you very much to them, and USSF. I don't think anyone from there is available either. So anyway, as you have the okay. So Rich Lee from my posse is going to represent USSF. Thank him. He'll pass it on. So yes, so thank you again to all of our sponsors, and thank you to all of you for coming. We're very, very fortunate today to have an old friend of the PNT community, probably the most senior and distinguished official I've seen regularly show up at PNT advisory boards over the course of the 10 years that I've been engaged, and we are very, very lucky to have him recently retired as the first Vice Chief of Space Force Operations. Please welcome General David Thompson for a few remarks and about his experience and thoughts on PNT.
All right, Dana, thanks for that. And actually, thanks for reaching out to me just a couple of months ago when I was thoroughly enjoying retirement, had nothing to do on any given day except attend to grandchildren. And you started pulling me back into the real world after retirement, so thanks for that. But it is great to be with all of you. Many of you I've seen over the years in various places and ways and roles, and of course a lot of you here in this very forum once or twice a year since about 2015. I will tell you that while I enjoyed every minute of my 38 years, 8 months, and 2 days in uniform, it's also very nice to be done. And, you know, I knew it was time to be done because I had spent so much time and I had grown up in such a different world as opposed to those young Space Force guardians who live in a new world, who understand a new world, and for whom thinking about space in the way that we have to think about it today is not a bolt-on. That's why I knew it was really time to move on. But I'm also excited, and I know some of you have been down this path before. At some point you realize that your work doesn't have to be done, and there's ways you can help and contribute and maybe make a difference on the other side of that page as well. And that's what excites me about what's coming next. I also do have to say, I've started making arrangements and agreements with various folks on what I'm going to do post-retirement. But tonight, what you hear from me is my own view, my own perspective, not related to anything. I no longer represent the Space Force. I'm not representing any company or any interest here other than who I am, what I am, and what I think about it. So if you like what you hear tonight, okay. If you don't like what you hear tonight, it's on me as well. And in fact, my relationship with this board does go back to 2015. And I have to tell you why I'm so committed to this board and what it did. 2015, I was a brand new vice commander of Air Force Space Command right out here at Peterson Air Force Base at the time. And my boss was a guy named General John Hyten. You might have heard of that guy. As the first of these board meetings was approaching after I'd arrived, he called me into my office and he said, DT, there's this thing called the PNT Advisory Board and they have a meeting coming up. Do you know what that is? My answer was, nope, don't know anything about it. So he explained it to me and then he said, here's the deal. Either you or I will be at every meeting of that PNT Advisory Board. And my schedule is really crammed. At which point I realized I was going to be at every meeting of the PNT Advisory Board. And again, he had explained to me what it was and why it was so important that a senior officer in Air Force Space Command, which had responsibility for GPS, needed to be representative there. And of course, he said it, so I believed it. But with each passing meeting of the PNT Advisory Board that I attended, I understood more and more why he valued and respected this organization and this board and what it does, and why he wanted that senior representation. So much so that once I was out of that role and General Hyten was no longer my boss, I still thought it was important as often as I could to get here and be part of that group, and if not, find another senior officer who could represent us well in that regard as well. And all you have to do is look at what this group has done, not just over the past 10 years, but before that, to understand if it was an issue, it was a concern, this board was involved and it was making a difference. All the way back to things like insisting that the GPS constellation be 30 satellites, not 24 satellites. That recommendation came out of this board. It was signed out by this guy named Brad Parkinson. You might have heard of him. Oh, by the way, he was also the guy who decided in the first place it should have been 24 satellites. But, you know, adding laser reflectors to the GPS constellation, insisting on the standard of performance that we see today and beyond. Fighting the spectrum wars, fighting against interference, fighting against jamming, fighting against people who think that 1,000,000 times the power you guys can share the same space. This board played a vital role in all of that, in insisting that the nation needed not just GPS, but had to adopt multi-GNSS. That was also a key part of this board. Insisting on cybersecurity protections for GPS ground systems, GPS receivers, and everything associated with the GPS constellation, as well as backups and augmentation. All of those things that have been important to the nation, its military service, its civil services, and its commercial capabilities for more than a decade. In fact, now approaching 20 years, this board has had a voice, and more than just a voice, it has so often been leading the way. And so while you think that all of that work has paid off, and it has, there's still a tremendous amount of more work to do, which is why I'm glad tomorrow's the meeting of the focus of the meeting tomorrow and the next day is PTA on protecting and toughening and augmenting GPS. Because while all of that work that I described over the previous 10 and 15 years did in some way, shape, or form help with protecting, toughening, and augmenting, there's still a whole lot more to do. In fact, I would argue that GNSS, GPS and more, is probably at a critical point in its life, more so than any other time, perhaps except for when it was first envisioned and in the early days of developing the constellation. And here's why. First, it's clear that GPS remains the gold standard for GNSS. In fact, we were at Space Symposium a couple weeks back. Del Della Pena, the program executive officer for the GPS program, reported there that the user range error for GPS just a few days earlier had hit 25 centimeters, 10 inches. It had never before in the history of that constellation gotten to that point. It was never designed or intended to achieve that level of accuracy, but it had just gotten to that point. It now has 25 M-code satellites on orbit, which is critically important to not just the operations of the Armed Forces of the United States, but all of those allies around the world, a couple of whom are engaged in combat operations today, that's of vital importance to them as well. So it remains the gold standard, but the world is a lot different than it has been over most of the previous 50 years that GPS has been in one way, shape, or form, either envisioned or in existence. We now have a world where there are a whole lot of other GNSS capabilities out there. Some are complementary, some are competing, and we have to understand to decide what that means and what we're going to do about it. We're also now not just talking about what it means to navigate in lunar space and around the moon. We're starting to take steps to what we're going to do about it and how we're going to be able to position ourselves and navigate reliably in and around the moon. We also, however, unfortunately, increasingly see that hostile actors are figuring out ways to use GPS in ways that we think are contrary to its purpose. Spoofing is actually becoming much, much more easy to do and harder to detect. You've got people using GPS for criminal activities in using drones and some of those sorts of things, to use them in ways and in spaces that endanger the public, but also may support criminal activity. And then finally, we've got adversaries out there in the world who are using GPS to attack U.S. forces and ours. And so not only are we reaping all of the benefits of GPS to the tune now approaching indirect costs every year of $1 trillion, we now have actors who wish us ill or have ill intent who are understanding the power of GPS and unfortunately, and GNS in general, and unfortunately using it to their advantage as well. All of this then, in the context of the United States Space Force, is now at a point where it is determining what its requirements are for providing space-based positioning, navigation, and timing for the future. Space Warfighting Analysis Center was one of those centers that we established with the creation of the Space Force to bring a broader context, a broader understanding, and a broader set of cost, schedule, performance, survivability, and vulnerability analyses to our design and fielding of space forces. They began last summer a mission design related to space-based PNT that is going to last here for the next several months before they decide and gain approval through the Department of Defense exactly what the next generation of space-based PNT from a military perspective and therefore civil and commercial perspectives should look like. And so for those of you who may not be aware of that activity, it would behoove you all to make sure you understand it, understand where they're going, because part of their process is to invite in stakeholders and users, in this case absolutely to include the civil aspects of the nation and the commercial aspects as well. And so that's the point at which we are with respect to PNT for the nation, for military purposes, for civil purposes, and for commercial purposes. Let me check here. I think I've got one more thing I want to say before you get back to enjoying. Okay, and so I'm going to say 3 things here tonight, maybe to give you food for thought and to challenge you. It's not really so much for what you're going to see and hear and talk about over the next day and a half. I see that, and I'm anxious as part of the general public to be here tomorrow and listen to the government go about its business and maybe even provide some criticism, who knows. But the first thing I want you to think about is this, is the A, as you know, in PTA is augment. And we have been talking about augmentation and backups and other things for a very, very long time. In fact, the Army has been leading the way inside of the Department of Defense in what they call alt-nav, alternatives to GPS, alternatives to GNSS. And Karen Van Dyke, who's here, at the Space Symposium 2 weeks ago said, I don't like that term. I like the term complementary. Excuse me, complementary GNSS. I would say that's better, but I would actually argue that I think it's time to go even broader than that. Just like in the past, we adopted the term multi-GNSS. I think it's time for all of us, and especially this community, to embrace the term of multi-nav. not alternate nav, not augmented nav. All of that says it's going to be space-based and everything else is an add-on or a bolt-on or a complement, or if we can't use it. Space-based PNT, for as far out as I can see, will be the primary means of positioning, navigation, and timing globally in most routine environments. But I think all of us leading the way have to start telling people that space-based PNT is one-dimensional, and every one-dimensional system has inherent vulnerabilities. And so I think it's incumbent on us not just to continue to push on GNSS, protecting, toughening, and augmenting GNSS, but push very hard on those other methods of positioning, navigation, and timing so that all of those solutions come together. Because I also believe that one of the ways you protect GNSS is make it so hard to defeat or have so many other options in terms of doing it, it makes much less sense to try and attack it because you're not going to succeed anyway. So I think I would encourage you all to think increasingly about multi-nav, not just multi-GNS or alt-nav or complementary nav. That's the first thing. Second thing is, I need my glasses for a minute here. Space Policy Directive 7 in January of 2021 said some very good things about space-based PNT policy for the nation. One of the things it said was specifically the job of the US government was to deny hostile use of the nation's space-based PNT capabilities without unduly corrupting civil and commercial use. Now, in writing that policy, I happen to know, because I was one of the folks that helped write and coordinate it, the intent was to prevent hostile use in combat zones, right? And we're seeing it today. We saw it then and we see it today, the one-way attack drones and things like that. What it was not intended to communicate is the need to protect the nation's space-based PNT against hostile use anywhere at any time. And I think it may be time for all of us to help the nation relook at that and not just say, you can't use our nation's space-based PNT, our GPS, against American troops. We have to think about how to make sure you can't use our GNSS and work with our friends and our allies and partners to find ways to prevent that sort of hostile and criminal and nefarious use for the constellations globally, not just in very specific regions and for very specific uses. And so I'd encourage you to think about whether or not in concert with the nation's leaders to think about being more aggressive in how we protect the use of GNSS for good and not for what we've seen it happen in a couple other things. And then the last thing is, this is the National Space-Based PNT Advisory Board. I think it's time to start thinking about striking space-based from that title for a couple of reasons. One, we already talked about, we should be talking about multi-nav, not just multi-GNSS. And the second thing is, this board and this community has never shied away from talking about PNT writ large. Recognizing your charter says space-based, in the 15 years I've seen, especially with the ringleaders at the front of that table, all of you have been very good at defining beyond what space-based means beyond just space-based itself. When you talk about backup, you talk about augmentation, you talk about protection. It may be time to challenge the nation's leadership to say that while the board in this room is not hampered by that term space-based, the national leadership might be, and expanding the charter of this organization to talk about all things PNT from a national perspective, military, civil, and commercial, would probably do great things for the nation, expand the charter, and perhaps even the voice and influence of this board and this group and this community beyond just relatively narrowly defined space-based PNT. But I do know this in any case, whether you resonate with some of those things or not, I know that you all recognize and understand, especially those of you who are new members of the board or adjunct members of the board or just interested parties like I am, that you all understand and value and respect and greatly appreciate the work of this board and its leadership, and especially those who have gone long over time in supporting the work of this board and the nation when it comes to PNT. Thanks all, I appreciate it. I look forward to talking.
Just a few additional comments. Maybe we take some questions.
I had to add something. We just met. Not. So we used to say in the GPS program office that at a certain point you got purple in your blood. Purple in your blood meant you were into the whole PNT construct, what we were trying to do, the objectives, and you understood it. And candidly, sir, you are part of we are very fortunate. We have two, Larry James, I believe, was also a TUSOPS commander. We have two former TUSOPS commanders. We have a former person who, as a second lieutenant, was on GPS. And we have this gentleman, and frankly, I was in awe of your remarks. I said, geez, I wish I could say it like that. Huh? So the point is, this gentleman has purple in his blood, and it has shown through in many, many respects that I suspect we don't even know about. And I think we owe him one hell of a round of applause for what he has done for us. And I'm hoping it will not stop.
And while we do have a lot of food to consume still, I think we might have time for a few questions if you're willing.
Absolutely. Sir.
Yeah, I've really appreciated your time over the years as you've come, and you struck a major thing on Multi-Nav, which in the automotive industry we've been using other kinds of navigation in addition to but my big question today is, since I mostly work in the international, I see China using Baidu as a real power fight against us. I see it, it's shown up directly in Pakistan. I see it showing up in Southeast Asia, in Africa, other parts of the Middle East. What should this board do to be able to help educate our political leadership that the issue is not, is GPS better or Baidu better or what have you? It's not a technical thing. The issue is that China has decided to make Baidu part of the international power fight. And they're fighting it on one side, and we seem to be standing around on the side watching.
So that's a hard question to answer. As have many of you, I've been in many discussions with national leadership inside the Department of Defense and in other government agencies. And part of the challenge is they don't understand it. And it's not just that they don't understand it, but they don't understand the implications of what you talked about. So I think in some cases, the best answer is just to keep working it. I know you now have a education committee, and although I think as I was looking, it is focused on the general public and maybe perhaps the young up and coming Americans, maybe you should add a subcommittee of that that's focused on the Hill and the White House and others. The other thing I'd say is maybe to consider is because when you think about the organizations, we've got the Department of Defense, you've got NASA, you've got Department of Transportation. I think there's commerce representation in here as well. To fight that fight on all fronts, it might be worth considering as well, how do we fully enlist the State Department? And I don't think we have State Department representatives, do we? Okay, so if you can help with that, that would be the great thing to do. But I think, I don't think what you're describing is much different than the challenge we faced in a lot of different ways. And I think we just have to keep sending the message here in a lot of other ways. But I will tell you that I think some in the various branches of government are starting to understand, and not necessarily because it's GPS or GNSS or Galileo or anybody else versus Beidou, but just because it is a larger aspect of the competition we face. And if we can add GNSS into that equation, that's probably the best way for success. Sure. Tom.
So, Space Force has rolled out the new Systems Delta and Integrated Missions Delta function, and I'm living through it at SSC. So, I mean, I kind of understand it at a very basic level, but I was wondering if you could explain, maybe in layman's terms, what the objective for this structure is.
Yeah, I will do. I'll do my best. And for those of you that may not be following it closely, over the years in the Air Force, Space Command, and early days of the Space Force, you basically have an organization responsible for acquisition of the spacecraft, acquisition of the ground system, acquisition of the chips that go into receivers, and they kind of deal with the acquisition, fielding, and the sustainment of those once fielded. And then we had another organization that was responsible for operating the system. Second Space Operations Squadron flew the constellations, did the uploads, all those sorts of things. What we found over the years was, and this is in some way a little bit of an artifact of the way space systems work, is because once the satellite goes into orbit, at least today, the only real way to sustain and upgrade that is through software uploads, right? You're not going to bring it in for dry dock. You're not going to bring it into the depot or to do the aircraft style maintenance. It's on orbit. And so what we seem to find over the years is the focus was on, from the acquisition side, was on design, build, fly, check it out, make sure it works, and then hand it over to operations. And oftentimes the sustainment piece, the upgrade to the ground software, the upgrade to the spacecraft software, some of the things you have to do to keep it fresh and current on the ground, we're not getting the focus and the attention they need, because we're all space people and we all love satellites and we're on to the next thing. And so what General Saltzman did was he left that initial phase of design and development and build and fielding in the traditional acquisition offices, Space Systems Command out at Los Angeles, and he took the sustainment piece and he combined it with the operations piece, because they're the ones who feel the most impact when sustainment is either there's not enough of it, it's not done right, or the priorities aren't right. And so what he did was put together, take the organization that was responsible for sustainment of all those primarily ground systems out of the acquisition community, put it together with operations, so that operations and sustainment was one activity integrated together, and they decided what they needed, what was most important, what would make them most effective in terms of their operations. And he created that new organization. Right now, we've got that in two organizations. One is the GPS organization. The second is Space Electronic Warfare. And we're testing that out to see how to work with the rest of them. But it really is carving out that sustainment, that long-term maintenance and sustainment piece of the activity that supports operations, and putting it together with operations so that it really is one integrated approach. Okay, sir.
So GPS is kind of a unique system in that it is fundamentally it's a military system where most of your users are civil, vast majority of them. And so you have competing interests between civil interests and military interests. The question to you is, do you feel that we're managing this correctly at this point, or could we do better? Sorry. I don't know that I can give you an objective answer. I do know that, well, there's and obviously there's two sides to that, right? The first is there are a lot of things that over the years have been a little bit of a struggle to get added into the GPS program. One of those obviously is retro reflectors. Took perhaps a little more time than it was originally planned. Working through some of the additional signals were worth a little more plan. The challenge is this, and and having sat in that seat, I understand it very well, right? You get paid so much money to do a mission, right? And it's not just, for us, it's not just, I get this much money and I spend it on GPS. You know, I get this much money, I have to decide what to spend on GPS, what to spend on missile warning, what to spend on communications. And you do get a little ruthless, right? You know, ruthlessness in a military organization is not a terrible thing, right? And so sometimes the mindset was, look, if you want me to do it, pay for it. But I think along the way, we've had enough of a relationship, especially through this board and with JJ and Karen and the other organizations that we've been able to work it. So I think, I mean, it is still the gold standard of the world. It's performing way better than anybody would have imagined. When you think of the types of things that we never dreamed it would do, it is doing. I would say, all told, we're doing pretty well. The thing we can do better, go faster, make it cost less money. So.
One more?
Sir.
I guess as one of the internationals in the room, I should ask if you have any thoughts on how you could better leverage, what's the term, like-minded countries in pursuing better BNT?
Yeah, I think the first thing that we should be doing, in the U.S. military anyway, is building multi-GNSS receivers. And doing that, I am not smart enough in how all of these systems work together to make them more effective together. But I do feel like we should be working harder to be able to take advantage of all of those capabilities. And actually, perhaps, we've got we have relationships and organizations with a whole host of nations for programs and capabilities and systems that we have mutual interest in. We do it for space domain awareness, we do it for satellite communications, we do it for missile warning and missile tracking. What we don't have is a group of international nations on the military side that work together on GNSS. And that's probably the one thing that would help almost immediately, is when those leaders of the Space Force and the Department of Defense and others sit down to talk about all these space capabilities. If they would add GNSS to that equation, we may see some very quick wins to help us all work together more effectively. I do not. I'll bet there's somebody in the room that does, but I don't. Sorry. Sir. Absolutely. Those that are operated by our friends, and those that are operated by those that aren't our friends. Absolutely. And maybe even doing some other things as well.
Thank you very much, sir. We look forward to joining you tomorrow. And
Enjoy.